by saying, you know, there's a couple of different reasons that we may do the confinement feeding. One of those may be as a drought mitigation tool, and I actually helped a lot of people with that this year because 2020 has been really dry in parts of the country. And so if it's used as a drought mitigation tool, it may include supplemental feeding on a sacrifice pasture. It may include creative spaces for confinement feeding, which might be a residue field or a pivot corner, or in our case at home is our equipment lot. But you can get pretty creative when you don't intend to be confinement feeding and have to be. And this is more likely to include a spring calving herd because the original intention was to have plenty of grass. Didn't. So that's one way, and there's almost a drought mitigation tool talk in and of itself. Confinement feeding can also be used as part of a system. And then in that case, then it was intended to have some part of it be confinement feeding. And so in that case, it may be because that the producer knows that they don't have enough perennial forage grazing to do a traditional cow-calf operation. So in this type of scenario, then there might be a short time of perennial grazing instead of all summer. And then there may be a short time of some annual forage grazing. It may include some residual grazing, so residues from a crop. May include some time in confinement, either fed a supplemental or a complete diet in different places. And it may include a less traditional calving date. If it was intended to be this way from the get-go, then a lot of people who have incorporated confinement feeding as a part of a system actually may choose to have a summer-born or a fall-born calf in that system. So the thing is that regardless of the reason for the confined feeding, and regardless of the forage resources, and regardless of calving date, cows in confinement have to be fed a diet to meet their requirements for successful production. And that's what tonight's talk was going to be on, is if you're in this situation, regardless of the reason, what are some things that you need to consider? Okay, Mary, I don't know how you want to do this because I haven't done one of these with you, but here's my interactive question.
Okay, I just launched the poll, and so Karla's question is it true or false statement, dry matter intake can be limited without limiting nutrient intake? So I'd ask you to go ahead and respond whether you think it's true or false. These are anonymous. We don't know who's answering what. And here in just a few minutes, we'll go ahead and share the results, and Karla can talk about whether that's a correct answer or not. Okay, we have about 7 responses so far. We'll take another few minutes here. All right, we got 9 responses out of 13, so I think we'll go ahead and end the poll, and I will share the results. Can everybody see the results? Karla, can you see them?
I can see them, yes.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, and so I would say this is a really smart group, and maybe you don't even need to sit in on this talk because that would be true. Everybody answered it right, that we can limit dry matter intake, and if we have the nutrient density correct in that diet, then we can maintain those cattle without hurting performance, even though they're not getting everything they want to eat. And that concept is a little bit like, I always try to use the example of eating 3 bags of carrots or eating 1 piece of cake. I might get the same calories out of it, but it would take me a lot longer to eat the carrots. I'd rather have the cake too, by the way. Okay, can I close the poll statement? Okay, it's not letting me move to my next slide, Mary.
So click on your slide again.
Ah, okay. Okay, now maybe it will let me. Okay. This technology's killing me, Mary. Okay. So one of the most critical aspects to feeding cows in confinement then is this ability to limit dry matter intake to a degree. So this is some research that I just wanted to show you as an example of where we did limit some dry matter intake. We had late gestation, so they were toward the end of pregnancy, multiparous cows, which just means they'd had more than one calf. And we either limit fed a diet that was 20% wet distillers grains, 20% sugar beet pulp, and 60% wheat straw on a dry matter basis. So obviously 2 of those feeds are very wet, so that's not really the actual proportions you'd put in the feed truck, but on a dry matter basis, this was how it was developed. We fed 8.6 pounds of dry matter, which is 1.6% body weight of that diet. This cow could probably easily eat 2.1% of her body weight, so it was a little bit limiting. When compared that to a diet that was 20% wet distillers grains and 45% beet pulp, so quite a bump in the beet pulp, and dropped the straw down to 35. And that's important for our region because we are so dry in western Nebraska that even wheat straw can be an expensive commodity. And sugar beet pulp, certain times of year, is very available and can be very economical. And so, and then I guess the other issue is that anytime you're trying to put something fluffy in a mixer, then, you know, you're limited to how big of a load you can do. So I was trying to see just, you know, what we could get away with in this. And so then we targeted 11 to 12 pounds of TDN per day in those cows, even with that limit feeding. And so when we look at the results of that study, then we actually see that we didn't have any significant differences in the performance between the 2 treatments. So the p-value on the right side of your slide there, it'd have to be a 0.05 for those to be truly different numbers, and none of those are even close to that. So basically, it didn't matter because as long as we formulated those diets to meet their nutrient requirements, we could limit feed them, and there wasn't a difference in the 2. And then the fact that we were able to include more of that beet pulp and less of the straw was very helpful for a couple of reasons for us out here. The other thing that I would draw your attention to is that even though we were trying to maintain those cows and they were limit fed, their dry matter intake was limited, their body condition score actually bumped up just a little bit. So they did a little better than maintenance, and it didn't matter which diet. So that's pretty easy to limit feed a gestating cow and maintain her that way. Okay, Mary, got another interactive question.
All right, the poll is launched, and we will see what you guys respond. I will say Karla's last slide says that Karla's really good at balancing rations, and she also maybe overestimates the requirement of a cow in confinement, which is not unusual. It seems like we have seen that quite a bit. So I think that's pretty interesting.
I think there could have been a couple of things there. I could have underestimated the energy value of the beet pulp for that cow. And I think that we have, in all the years that we've been doing this confinement cow research, we have found that the more sedentary lifestyle that cow gets used to, the easier it is to maintain her. So.
Okay, we have 7 responses so far. We got 14 people, so I'll give them a couple more minutes. You gave them more choices this time, so it might take a little longer.
I was trying to be hard on this one.
Tricky.
No.
Okay, we got 9. Last call. All right, I'm going to end the poll. I'll share the results.
Okay. Actuality, that cow that is in, I gotta see my question again here. Okay. That cow that is in the second trimester, so she hasn't started the very end of her pregnancy and she doesn't have a baby that she's nursing, she's actually down in that 8 to 10 region for the most part. So, I mean, you could bump that up to 11 or 12 or something for good measure, or for weather conditions or things like that. But honestly, that's a point in her career, I guess, her production cycle. Maybe cows don't have careers, but in her production cycle, that's a point when her energy needs are honestly the lowest. Okay. So something to think about there. Oh, look at me, Mary, I got that to go. Okay, so here's another example of a late gestation diet, a trial that we did. And the reason I had to include this one is because one time Mary and I went somewhere to do a talk and I showed that last trial and she was like, we don't have beet pulp all the way across the state. So she was like, that's just too creative of a diet. So I threw in a non-creative diet to show you that it's that concept of knowing the energy value of the feeds that you're working with, or any of the nutrients really, and that you can limit feed and meet the needs of that cow if you know what the cow's nutrient requirements are, and if you know what the nutrient content of your feedstuffs are. So in this trial, we actually limit fed some ground alfalfa. And because it's not as nutrient dense as the diets with the distillers, we had to feed a little more to meet the requirements, but we still limited them at 1.8%. Right? And then we compared that to a 30% wet distillers, 70% wheat straw diet on a dry matter basis. And that one was 1.7% body weight. And so then we did balance that out with some additional calcium because of the phosphorus in the wet distillers, whereas alfalfa is pretty good on calcium. So that trial, you'll see that there weren't much for differences between the two. P-values are above 0.05, except for the change in weight in pounds, and that was significantly different there, where the cows that were on the wet distillers grains and straw showed a significantly different increase in weight. Body condition score was actually very, very similar for those two groups. So we thought that that change in weight, that significance might be due to the maybe a heavier calf, but we did follow those cows through, and after weighing those calves at birth, we did not pick up that difference there. Maybe doesn't mean it wasn't there, but we couldn't pick up that significantly. So not sure really what that difference is there. But again, you see that they had a positive change in body condition score. And again, it didn't really matter what we were using. The one treatment is simply limited alfalfa hay. The other one was probably a much cheaper diet, because alfalfa hay tends to be a pretty expensive forage source, especially in western Nebraska. But again, the point being, there's nothing magical about this. It's just knowing the nutrient. Okay, Mary, interactive question.
All right, I've launched the poll again. This one, she's asking about a lactating cow and peak lactation. What do you think her requirements are? So she told you a dry cow at her lowest requirement was at 8 to 10, so that might give you some idea.
Mary's helping us out. She's telling us how to eliminate answer possibilities. That's a true academic.
So I take all my tests. So Karla, you mentioned we need to know the nutrient content of the feeds. And basically, it sounds a lot like you may be somebody's best friend in helping them come up with the ration if they know their costs and they know the nutrient content. Are there some feeds that you suggest they make sure they test?
So I think your hays, for sure, need to be sent into a commercial lab, and so we have a good idea of what we're dealing with there. When we use byproducts like wet distillers grains or some wet corn gluten feed or beet pulp, I mean, any of those, those byproducts have highly digestible fiber in them. So feeding trials actually indicate that those have a lot more energy in them than a nutrient analysis test would suggest. So when we send our forages in to a commercial lab, the TDN, or total digestible nutrients, is a calculated measure from ADF, or acid detergent fiber. So that higher fiber content of those byproducts kind of causes them to have a lower energy value on that piece of paper. But when you feed them, all of our tons and tons of research that we've done on distillers and wet corn gluten feed and beet pulp would suggest that they're a little higher than that. So I think, it's okay to ask some university personnel, what energy value should I be plugging in for my byproducts? And then it really helps me if I don't have to guess what your forages are.
So test your hays and don't worry about the byproducts.
Well, I think from an energy standpoint, but, it may not hurt you to test the byproducts for some other things, calcium, phosphorus, sulfur, things like that. Dry matter, that's very important for me, because I'm giving you a lot of amounts here that are on a dry matter basis, but that's not what you put in your mixer wagon. And so we have to account for the water that's in the feed, or the moisture that's actually in the feed. And when we're feeding very wet feeds like beet pulp or wet distillers grains, things like that, it makes a huge difference. And so to help people understand that concept, I usually try to use the analogy of trying to eat a pound of watermelon or a pound of saltine crackers. Which one are you going to get through the easiest? And so you're going to get through the watermelon, because you're not actually eating a pound of dry matter in a pound of watermelon. Most of that is water. And so if I wanted to get a pound of dry matter out of a watermelon, I might have to eat, I don't know what the actual moisture content of a watermelon is, but I'm assuming it's a lot. So I might have to eat, 5 pounds of watermelon to get a pound of the actual dry pink stuff, if that makes sense. So.
It does. Okay, so I shared the poll results. The majority was guessing 16 to 18. How'd they do?
They did good. I'm telling you, this group is not going to have any questions because they're super smart. Okay, so our question was, if you have a mature lactating 1,250 pound moderate milking cow, peak lactation, where's her energy requirement? And so it is about double what it is when she's in mid-gestation with no baby on her. So that 16 to 18 is probably going to hit most of those cows in that description. So lactation changes everything with a cow. And I think that that we know that intuitively, but I'm going to show you some examples of something that will hopefully help you understand that when we're in confinement, we have to be much more cognizant of that change than when we're out on grass. Okay, so this graph shows you if you had a cow that had a calf in June sometime, she would be hitting peak lactation in August. So that red line would be calves that would be early weaned at 90 days of age or so. And you just see how that energy demand in that cow, once you remove lactation, just drops off significantly. The blue part of the line would be a group of cows that would hit peak lactation. but they would still be nursing their calf, and then through the lactation time period that's normal for us, 180, 200 days, that energy demand is going to slowly drop off because the amount of milk production drops off a little bit. But you can see that then we get out there to January, we wean that calf, then she's back where the early weaned cow that doesn't have a calf on her, where her energy requirements would be. And the reason I like to show this graph is because I feel like it really depicts the difference between that same cow and her energy needs with and without lactation. So it's huge. Okay. So as I said, it's not that we don't know that, but if this cow is a 1,200 pound running age cow and she requires 16 to 17 pounds of TDN and 2.7 pounds of crude protein, let's just say the green grass that she's out on is 65% TDN, could be actually more than that, 11% crude protein, could be more than that. And she eats 26 pounds of dry matter every day of that grass she's out there grazing, which she could probably eat at that digestibility. The likelihood that she's going to eat even more than that is pretty good. But even at just that, see, she's already right there at her requirement for both of those. Okay, so if she ate a little more than that, she probably, she might even be putting on a little weight. And sometimes we do see that when we turn cow out to pasture. So that's why we don't think a lot about that difference between gestation and lactation, is because usually right after cows start lactating is when we go to grass with them. Okay, so I'll give you an example of if you were in confinement because you have a spring calving herd and there is no grass yet and it's early in spring. You have that same cow with the same requirements, and let's say she's eating 21.8 pounds of winter range and 5 pounds of a 40% protein cube on a dry matter basis. That's a lot of cubes to be feeding, but let's just say that's what we're doing. That cow's still only getting 15 pounds of TDN. You're meeting her protein, but she's not getting enough energy for what you're now asking her to do. Okay. So if you say, well, yeah, but I don't use winter range at that point, I'm feeding her meadow hay at that point, and then I'm supplementing some protein. And so if we did that, we would have a little more energy provided to the cow, but we'd still be a little short. And so we tend to do that, don't we? Somewhere between calving in March and April and when we can get out to grass somewhere in May and June. And so those cows are probably losing a little bit of condition on us, but then we're going to go to grass and then they're going to have to eat and it's going to be high quality and they're going to make that up. So my point in showing you this is if we're in a confined situation, they're not going to grass. That change from gestation to lactation and that diet is all up to us. And we have to be cognizant of that and make sure that the diet that we put them on once we go to lactation is adequate. And so this diet is an example of one that then we could feed, and it would provide the 17 pounds of TDN and the protein that she required. So I put the dry matter pounds each of those: ground corn stalks, wet distillers grain, some corn silage. Mary and I were talking before the webinar started that particularly this year and maybe a lot of years, but particularly this year and especially in western Nebraska, because we had such a horrible drought this year, all of our forages, whether it's hay or residue, is very expensive, and actually corn silage comes into our diet rations very nicely. And so I did throw that in there because for us right now, it probably makes more sense to throw some silage in than to try to feed that much baled roughage, harvested roughage like that. And then I did put some pounds of as is, but of course I'm estimating dry matter is what that is. And so again, when you do your forage sampling, if you get that dry matter, to come back on that analysis, then it makes my ability to help you a whole lot easier. So that particular diet would do it. And the only other thing that I would add that's really not on here is the mineral package. And I'm sure Mary's done a webinar on minerals, and you can go back and watch that and see where you are on that. But that is another thing to keep in mind, is that when we are confining and they aren't going out to grass and picking up some of those things that we tend to expect them to be able to get from those higher quality forages, then any deficiencies that we might be creating by the commodities that we choose, we better make sure that we get those supplied as well. So that's probably a whole nother webinar though.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would just chime in here that the only thing that's really struck me as being very different has been the magnesium issue that we see when we feed diets that have quite a bit of distillers in there. With a roughage based diet, we do see that we get some interference with magnesium absorption, much like what you might expect with grass tetany in the spring.
Yeah. And I'd say we've both had our share of issues with that.
So I would suggest to people that one thing they might consider in that case is making sure they have a high mag mineral supplement. That's been probably one of the things that we had to learn going along, because we can formulate the ration to meet magnesium requirements, and yet we're not meeting magnesium requirements.
Yeah, because of the interference there, or the antagonism, maybe is there a better word for that?
Okay, I'm going to launch your last poll here. So Karla wants to know what you guys think about how much dry matter a 400-pound nursing calf might consume. Oh, good. We're quicker on the draw today. We got 9 out of 16, 10 out of 16, 11. Chugging along.
Yep.
That's because they were answering the question in their head when I was talking.
They were prepared. This is like the advanced class, you know, like the, you know, in your high school and you go to the one English class and it's for the, what do they call that? The
AP.
Yeah. Yes, the AP class. These are the AP kids. Okay. All right. So, are we done? Are we ready?
Yes.
Okay.
Here's the results.
Okay. Yeah, so 4 is good. I'm sure they would eat every bit of that. But by the time he's a 400-pounder, he might be eating closer to that 6.5, actually, which is kind of amazing, because we have a tendency to think that as long as he's on the cow, that most of his feed is coming from the cow. And I don't want to discount or not credit the value of the milk in his growth, because there's a lot of very digestible nutrients in that milk, and because when he sucks, that esophageal groove closes and that bypasses the rumen and goes straight to the abomasum, then he's getting a lot of good nutrition out of milk. So I don't want to discount that, but it's also important for people who are raising calves in confinement to realize how much feed that calf out on grass is actually eating when he's not nursing his cow. And so again, if we're taking that calf out of that grazing situation and we're putting him in confinement, then it's up to us to try to simulate that as best we can. Okay, when we're managing the needs of the cow-calf pair, we have the nutrient needs of lactation, which is all on us now because we're not out on grass. We have this concept of limit feeding, which is important to the economics of maintaining that cow. And then that's made kind of peanut butter sticky or kind of mucky. Maybe actually it's the jelly of the peanut butter that makes it sticky. But anyway, the other factor that muddies this a little bit is that here you're trying to limit feed this cow a little bit, but you've got the dry matter intake of the calf. This becomes very important. And it is very important because of the importance in that intake of dry feeds in the development of the rumen. So I would just say before we move on to this slide that that very young calf, that 1 to 2 month old calf, he may only be eating 1% of his body weight in forage, but that is critical for him to develop his rumen so that he can, when it is time to wean, he can make up nutrients in the feed. So when we are limit feeding confinement, bunk space becomes very important, okay, because they're going to clean that feed up pretty fast. So it's not like a feedlot setting where, you know, we can put feed in the bunk and then the most dominant calves eat and then the more timid calves come up and eat later. I mean, they're going to clean this up. And so if it's a real timid cow and she gets pushed around a lot, she's not going to be able to consume her part. So if we're in a bunk feeding situation, then the 2 feet per cow, you know, we need to think about that. Roughly another foot for calves. When I'm feeding out on a residue field or through my equipment lot, as happens to be the case right now at my house, it's much easier to string that out so that there's plenty of space for those cows that are more timid, and so that does help them ensure that they're going to get their share. A consistent feeding routine is very important when you're limit feeding, because then those cows get a little more settled in the fact that they're not getting everything they want to eat, but that they are they know when they're going to get to eat. And so that does take out some of that concept of you know, some people think, man, if I limit feed, they're just going to be crawling through the bunk, but they do get pretty used to it. If you're going to feed at the same time every day, then that's kind of, you know, they know that's when to go up to the bunk. But then knowing the nutrient contents of the commodities is obviously important. If you underestimate the energy of, say, distiller's grains and then you overfeed it, then it's expensive. And this year it's kind of expensive. And then if you can also underfeed the cows going the other way. So you got to kind of know what you're doing. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit of the development of the calf. Rumen development requires feed and water. Dry matter intake besides milk is typically 1 to 1.5% of the body weight by the time he's 2 months of age, and it goes up from there. And that's why that 400-pound calf that was still nursing the cow is still maybe eating 6 pounds of dry matter or better, because he's not 2 months of age. So given that this is the case for them, and if they were out on grass, they would be nibbling at grass all the time, then we need to think about where it is that we have the calves confined and make sure that it's possible for them to reach feed of some sort, and that they can also reach the water. And reaching the water is more than just the bunk not being too high for them to reach into it, but also think about, do all the cows come in and drink that tank down, and then the water in the tank takes too long to fill up, and then that calf never gets a chance to get a really good drink? Now that doesn't necessarily have to be just a confinement situation. We probably ought to be thinking about that out on our pastures too. But if the flow of the water is too restrictive, or the amount that the tank holds is too small, and so when the cows drink it all down, it's not available to the calf, then that becomes an issue for that calf. So we need to, you know, kind of think about that. So other ways to provide some intake to the calf besides the bunk, if that's not where you want to do it. Obviously a creep feeder itself works fine. Commercial creep feeds can be kind of expensive, and so not against them, but you also need to be very careful as to, you know, what cost you're putting into the calf in this situation. This picture on the right is actually a producer that I work with. He actually has a hot fence, and above a piece of irrigation pipe and kind of a trench dug in front of that. And the cows reach under that and eat that. Between each irrigation pipe, there's a space that the calves can walk under the wire because they don't have to step over the pipe, and they actually come out and they eat on the other side of the cows. And then what's not in the picture is that there's some grazing and some other feeds that the calves go eat. And then when they want to be back with their mom, they crawl back through the fence. And so that's his way of creep grazing in a kind of an economical setup for him. And that works extremely well for him. There's another picture of a lot that had set up this way. The calves had access to feed that the cows did not. And they also had some shade and maybe some wind protection there. So different ways to do that. Be very creative. I would encourage you, regardless of whether you're doing confinement feeding as part of the system, or even if this is just, they're confined in the spring prior to going out on grass even, and you're just on this webinar because it was interesting and you're not really going to do confinement feeding, I would still encourage you to have a place for your calves to go when they are somewhat confined, away from the cows, where they have a dry, clean place to lay down. This can really help you with your health issues with the calf when they're not in an area that has a lot of concentrated manure. Can really help with a lot of health issues, preventing health issues. And so these particular pictures is a spring herd right after a storm, and this is where all the babies were and the cows were standing outside of it. But I also use the same setup for my fall-born calves, and they use it for shade and then just a place to kind of a quiet place to be away. So it's not bad, but it wasn't expensive to set up. So then to wrap it up, I just want to talk a little bit about a project that we have going on. It's managing the calf in confinement systems. And this is a current project that Mary and I have going on with a graduate student. This is only 1 year worth of data, so we're not really ready to go to the bank with this yet, but this is what we have so far. What we did is we had a group of calves that we weaned at 120 days of age, and they were fed hay, distillers, and corn. And the calves, then two groups of calves that, one group of the calves stayed with the cows until they were 210 days of age. And they were just eating the cow's diet with the cow. And the cow's diet was predominantly wet distillers and wheat straw. Then there was a group of calves that were staying with the cows until they were 210 days of age. And then they were supplemented with the weaned calf diet that was hay, distillers, and corn, but in a different bunk that the cows couldn't reach. So they had a little creep gate between that pen and the cow's pen. And so they could go over with their cow, or they could go through that little vertical creep gate and eat out of the bunk that the cows couldn't reach. And so this, just on a dry matter basis, tells you what we were feeding the cows, and then what we were feeding the calves. And so we just had higher quality hay, distillers, and corn for the calves, and then actually we had a little bit of corn in the cow diet, but not much. Okay, so December, these would have been like August and September born calves for the most part. So December, middle of December was when the average of the calves would have been about 4 months old, 120 days. So at that time, in that late summer or Nebraska fall born calf, that's life, then that's when we early weaned the one treatment. And then the other two treatments stayed with their cow until March. And so what you see is that at the ending weight for March, or at 110 or 210 days, then days of age, the calves that were on the creep diet gained the most, had the heaviest weights. The early weaned calves were intermediate, and those that only ate what the cows ate, they had the least amount of gain. So then I have calf dry matter intake, and so the reason I have lines on the no supplemented is because then if you go over a column, the pair dry matter intake was, we were trying to estimate what we should feed the cow and the calf, not knowing, not knowing that you can't actually separate out which one's eating what. And then the early weaned calves, then those calves had their own intake, and then that is just cow intake for the dry cow that's now over in a pen by herself. And then the creep there's a pair, and then the calves. You don't really know that just the cows ate the cow diet, but we tried to feed her assuming that it was just for her and that the calf would eat what he wanted. So then on the calf dry matter intake, on the early weaned and the creep, those calves had a bump call, just like a feedlot calf would, and so they chose how much they wanted to eat of that. And then the last column shows you the body condition score of the cows in March on those various treatments. And obviously our early weaned cow that wasn't doing much with herself, even though she was limited to 17 pounds of dry matter, she gained a little weight. So what we did is we did a growing diet after they were weaned in the feedlot for about 85 days or so, and then they went on a finisher, and they're still on the finisher, so I don't have any of those results for you. But the growing diet that all the calves received then after 210 days, so at 210 days now, early weaned or not, everything's weaned. And so this is on a dry matter basis what that diet was, and you'll notice that it has soybean meal in it, even though this was conducted in western Nebraska, and that's because all the mess this spring, ethanol plants shut down. I couldn't get any distillers, so that's what we did. So this shows you April to July, so that growing period, everything weaned, what their performance. And so what you find is that even though the non-supplemented calves on the nursing period, so at this point everything's on the same diet, but the treatments are still what they had previously, if that makes sense. So we're just following those treatments through. But those calves that had not received supplement when they were on the cow experienced some compensatory gain. So they did gain at a higher rate than like the creep calves. They were similar to the early weaned calves, but they did not catch up weight-wise with the creep-fed calves or the weaned calves, and they had similar intakes really. So that was kind of interesting. So Mary tried to put together some cowboy economics to this. And so these are like partial budget comparisons of the feeding component of this. And so she took 6-year averages of calf value at the given weight at each stage, and then the value of the feed, the average 6-year average value of the feed that we put into those calves. And we tried to evaluate any return in the calf above the feed cost. So these are really just comparisons of the 3 treatments on a feeding, because of the feeding. So if you look at December, which was the early weaned time point, so 4 months of age down to March 210, 7 months of age, then the calves that were not supplemented during that time didn't have very good return above their feed cost, and the creep fed ones had the best. If you looked just at the growing period from March to July after everything was weaned, then because of that compensatory gain, those no supplemented calves during the nursing phase had more return above their feed costs because they gained better for the feed they were given. But if you look at going from December, when we did the early wean thing, all the way to the end of the growing period, then they kind of come together a little bit better. But possibly the best return is still out of those creep-fed calves. So I think that kind of what it tells us is that if we are not going to supplement, then we probably do want a growing period to make some of that up. And if we do want to sell at a normal traditional calf weaning time period, 6-7 months of age, that some creep feeding of some sort may be warranted there. So our preliminary economics would suggest if you're selling calves at a traditional weaning date, supplementation would yield the best returns. If you're not supplementing, a growing period is going to improve your returns. And again, that's our first year of data, and we're still working on this project. So the other point that I want to make with confinement is that every producer has a unique system. They have various resources, different things to work with, everything's different. And so you got to determine what's going to work best for any given operation. And that may have to be a little bit fluid too. So this is my summary, I'm almost done. And then you guys can talk or ask questions. But confinement systems can have a lot of variation in management and resources. So what works for your neighbor may not be exactly the best thing for you, but you can have a lot of opportunities to do things that will work for you if you kind of sit down and look at your whole picture of what you're doing. Limit feeding cows is using the most inexpensive commodities that you can acquire and feed while still meeting their nutrient needs is critical. And then I would say knowing the nutrient needs is critical at each stage, and then knowing the nutrient content is critical, because if you don't know those things, you really can't balance the diet well. And then you got to manage your calves with the big picture in mind, I think, as to what your management plan is with them, where you're going with them, your